Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Skyfall, the latest James Bond movie. Now, while I'm a fan of this franchise, it's been a long time since I've seen most of those films, so honestly, I cannot remember which one is which. I'll remember some scenes, locations, or even storylines, but I can't place the movie they came from. So what I decided to do was I watch all the James Bond films from the beginning, which was, the first one was Dr. No, and just watch them in order, and reevaluate them. And so far, I've gotten up to You Only Live Twice, so I haven't gotten too far, but they've held up very well. They're very enjoyable. I like how breezily paced they are. They aren't in a hurry to get over with, but at the same time, they're not slow. They're very exotic, and I think the point I'm trying to make is it's strange how the Bond films have evolved over the years. So when you look at the earlier movies, they're spy adventure films. They're more about exotic locations, sexy women, witty banter with the villains, and James Bond himself being very charismatic. Whereas these days it's all about action and more action, and a lot of people didn't like this transition, but I'm okay with it as long as the Bond films can retain their identity. I don't want to see a Bond movie and think it's just like every other action movie ever made. I think that was the main problem with Quantum of Solace. Now, as just an action film, it was decent. I think it provided lots of pretty cool action scenes, but it didn't feel like it needed to be a Bond movie. It just happened to have Bond as its protagonist. Everybody compares it to the Bourne trilogy, or I guess it's no longer a trilogy, but that is a pretty good comparison. But Casino Royale, the film that preceded that, I thought that was a much better balance. It felt like a true Bond film, while at the same time it was still more action-oriented than most of the previous Bond movies. But when you just consider the different generations of Bond, you went from a relatively normal spy adventure to really campy and over-the-top to incredibly dark and grisly to whatever the Pierce Brosnan movies were. I guess they were kind of a mix between real dark and gritty, then really campy and silly. Then you have these ones now, and each of the Bonds are very different in terms of personalities. Now, Daniel Craig is one of the more polarizing Bonds, at least among the people I know. It seems like the reviewers are mostly backing him, but a lot of my friends really don't like him. I personally think he does a good job. I think he's not the best Bond, but he was much better than what I expected. When you look at, for example, Sean Connery is considered the best James Bond, and he's probably my favorite too. I think what makes him work is that he seems like he'd be a lot of fun to hang around. He's badass one moment, suave and charming the next when he's romancing some chick, and he could be really witty and sophisticated, and it just goes really well together. And Sean Connery can play all those different parts perfectly, and it always feels like the same character. Whereas Roger Moore, he really played up the suave persona much more, and as such he was fine. I didn't really buy him as a badass, but yet he fit that sort of campy tone his movies were going for. Now with George Lazenby, people seem split. A lot of fans have praised him for kind of tackling the darker side of Bond, which had never been done before at that point. Others don't think he was a very good actor. Honestly, if I've ever seen On Her Majesty's Secret Service before, I don't remember it, so I can't tell you. Timothy Dalton, he was much edgier. He was a pretty believable badass, but he wasn't particularly funny. I don't remember enough of that to really judge him, so that's another thing. You have to sort of take it as you will. Pierce Brosnan is actually who I think of when I think of James Bond, because I grew up with his movies. Those were what were coming out when I started getting into Bond. It was a pretty early age. I must have been 10 when GoldenEye came out. But also, I was so much in love with that GoldenEye video game for the N64. I played it nonstop. So, in a way, when I think of Bond, I just think of Pierce Brosnan for that reason, even if he's not the best. What's unique about his performance is you never forget that he's a cold-blooded killer. Even when he's seducing some chick, he never really totally drops that persona. Whereas with Sean Connery, it was like an on and off button. He could be suave one moment, then cold-blooded the next. Pierce Brosnan, he never dropped that cold-blooded side to him, so I really respected that. And Daniel Craig, I think he borrows elements from all the Bonds, but in a way I kind of see him the same way as I look at Pierce Brosnan, where Even when he's being suave, he never drops that, edge to his performance. And Daniel Craig also works a little bit more in that he has a much greater physical presence. You could definitely buy him as a badass. So, moving on to the actual movie, Skyfall. I really like Casino Royale, and I was okay with Quantum of Solace. Skyfall is definitely better than Quantum of Solace. Probably in the same league as Casino Royale. I haven't decided if I liked it more yet. I need to watch Casino Royale again. Is it one of the best Bond movies? No, but I really appreciated it. It actually tries to go back and do some things that the earlier films did, but then it also brings them into the more action-oriented context. The story follows James as he is wounded and they fake his death, but then a new enemy starts targeting M specifically, so James Bond has to come back and save the day. There's a lot of references to the older films. If I had been told about this beforehand, I probably would have been really concerned, but I thought this movie did a pretty good job at it. A few times it backfires, but I thought the references were, it was a treat for the fans, but it was never like relying too much on them. I think that's what I hate about movies that go too far with referential jokes, is it almost like relies on them, so it just reminds you of how good the movies it's referencing are, but and you want to watch those instead of what you're currently watching. So I appreciated that, but what really stood out for me was just how badass the action was. There is one amazing action set piece after another. Very memorable stuff. The cinematography captures it perfectly. I'm sure CGI had to be used, but honestly, the only times the CGI was obvious was with the animals, ironically. The Komodo dragon and the scorpion look pretty fake. But like at one point a train crashes. That looks totally realistic. A helicopter crashes. Totally realistic. When he rips off the back of a train with a tractor, I mean, it looks like that's what's really happening. And the fact that this has such wonderful special effects really makes all its contemporaries seem worse. So props to this movie just for that alone. And for the most part, the action never lets up, but at the same time, it's never too much either. It also knows when to settle down, focus on Bond and how awesome he is. But at the same time, he's pretty sloppy now because he's been in retirement for quite some time, so he's no longer, as buff and badass as he used to be. But it uses that, I think, really well. It makes him more vulnerable, more flawed. So it raises the stakes. And the villain, holy shit. What's his name? Javier Bardem. I could be pronouncing that wrong. He's the main bad guy from No Country for Old Men. He is probably one of my favorite Bond villains now. He's so flamboyant and over the top, but he's also menacing. You really do feel like could be the guy who could take Bond on, maybe even win. My problem with the previous Bond villains and the Daniel Craig movies is you never really feel they have a chance. Even though I like, what's his name, Mads Mikkelsen, in Casino Royale, the villain was just sort of a part of a bigger organization. He was overshadowed by Quantum. In the second movie, I liked the actor and I think he did okay, but the villain himself was just really unremarkable. I can't really remember anything about him. But this guy, he's incredibly intelligent, psychotic, but also really focused and dangerous, but at the same time he's really funny too. You just enjoy seeing him on screen. And one thing that really cracked me up is when he meets Bond for the first time, there's a lot of homoeroticism there. Now, homoerotic subtext has always been around in Bond movies when it comes to the villains, but this is not, there's no subtext about this. It's really blatant, and it has fun with it, so it makes that scene incredibly entertainingly uncomfortable. If you go to rape James Bond or something. So, but the scenes they had together were golden. But as a whole, he was a great villain. You kind of feel bad for him, but at the same time, he never completely gets your sympathy. They do a lot more with the M character. They stress that, she's made some real bad mistakes in the past, and her whole personality is pretty much coming to bite her back in the ass for the plot of this movie. But at the same time, you never totally hate her. You can understand why she made the decisions she did. And they sort of try to develop Bond. I'll get a little bit more into that later. But really, I think it did a good job balancing the spectacle side of things with the more character-driven side of things. There's a lot of good humor, great dialogue, and a lot of fun interactions. But at the same time, there's some real badass action scenes surrounding all of this. Unfortunately, it's not perfect. The first flaw I caught was with the quasi-love story. Well, there's two love interests. One is unnamed, but we know she's going to turn out to be Moneypenny by the end of the movie. I can't even really be spoiling that because it's so obvious. I had no problem with that. But the other one, I can't even remember the girl's name, but it reminded me of the love interest from Thunderball, I believe, where in that film Bond seduces the mistress of the main villain. Well, that pretty much happens here too, but it didn't work quite as well. You don't really understand why this character is necessary because she isn't in it that much. She's not much of a presence. Even though I really like the actress, she did a great job conveying fear, and she was really hot. But whereas with Thunderball, I think it worked much better just because that was much more of a character who was prominent throughout most of the movie. And this one, it just kind of felt like a weird sidetrack moment. So that, I think, was a problem. That was actually where I think the reference backfired, because I'm presuming that was sort of referencing Thunderball with that. But that was a little difficult to buy. But then my biggest complaint is I just felt that it ran out of steam by the end. It climaxes like 25 minutes before the movie actually concludes. And that is never a good sign, because what it's doing, it builds up so well, and I'm totally into it. It's really intense and exciting, and then it suddenly stops and slows down and starts going back to more character-driven moments. But this is close to the end of the movie, and it just slows down too much to where I started like getting impatient and bored. And it's a shame because the finale in itself is really well done. The action is still amazing. There's some funny moments, some touching moments. And the cinematography is gorgeous throughout the entire movie, but they definitely have a lot of fun with using that location they're at the very end of the film. But it just, at that point, I started getting bored. And they're like toying with giving us some backstory for James, but they don't go far with it enough to make it relevant. So, I don't know, I think it just kind of fell apart during the finale, even though the finale in itself isn't bad. It just... I started losing interest by that point. So would I recommend it? Absolutely. I think it's worth at least a matinee. If you're a big Bond fan, especially a fan of Daniel Craig, even full price, it deserves to make a lot of money because I had a blast. All in all, this actually was a great weekend for me because I watched Jean-Claude Van Damme's 6 Bullets, loved it. I think it was called Five Fingers with Lawrence Fishburne and Brian Felipe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Loved it. And then The Lincoln Lawyer, which even though I'd seen that before, I really liked that one too. So this was a great weekend, but Skyfall was a perfect way to get started because it was a spectacular action film. Flawed, but really worth watching. So that is my review. I did not do a written version of this. Follow me on Twitter. Make sure you watch my Cinema Snob movie review if you haven't yet. And I'll see you guys later.